Okay, thanks Danielle. So bore da, morning everyone, croeso, and thanks for joining us this morning. I'm Gwen O'Connor, I'm Clinical Lead at the Resilience Project, and I'm joined by my colleagues Danielle, Sharp Resilience Worker, and Katie Bowen for our training this morning. So just before we get started, just to let you know how this morning's going to run. So we've got a presentation that we'll talk through for about an hour. So get comfortable, grab a drink if you want to. And then we'll have some time to think about any questions that have come up as we've been talking. So please do use the Q&A tab on the Zoom toolbar to post your questions, your thoughts, your reflections as we're going through, and we can then address those at the end. We're going to send out the slides afterwards, so don't worry too much about having to take lots of notes. We'll also email out some of the resources we're going to mention as well. You'll notice the presentation's being recorded so that people can access it in future, but rest assured your faces and voices won't be in that recording, it will just be us as presenters. And at the end, we're going to send out a link to the evaluation. We're quite a new service, we'd really appreciate any feedback you have for us. Next slide, please, Danielle, and next one again. Next slide again, please, thank you. So just a little bit about the Resilience Project before we get started. So the Resilience Project is an NHS-led project with Cardiff and Vale Health Board in partnership with Cardiff and Vale local authorities and the Mental Health Foundation as well. And the project, what we offer is resources about mental health for education staff, for families and children and young people. Training, so obviously why you're all with us this morning. So this morning's training, we're specifically looking at unpicking mental health difficulties in children and young people through an ACEs lens. But we also have some training on understanding distress, which looks more about the neurobiology of children and young people's distress, and also about self-harm. We also offer consultation to education staff, thinking about children and young people's individual specific needs for young people concerned about. And we do some groups within schools. We can do those for young people, but also around staff wellbeing. And then also a small amount of direct work with children, young people and families. And we do all this work in really close partnership with the inclusion and engagement services in Cardiff and Vale. So next slide, please, Danielle. Thank you. So the aims and objectives of our training today. So we're going to have a think about what is mental health, this term we hear so much about all the time. We're then going to think about actually how common mental health problems for children and young people, and then spend a little bit of time thinking about the most common difficulties that children and young people experience, so anxiety and low mood in particular. Then we're going to go on to really, I guess, try to unpack what is it that actually makes a child or young person more likely to experience a mental health difficulty? And at the same time, what are the protective factors that can help to decrease that risk? We'll then spend a bit of time thinking about how we can actually increase those protective factors in schools to promote children's resilience. And whilst this training was developed pre-COVID, we've also put some ideas in about how we can do that during the current lockdown. And then we'll just really briefly touch on where to go if there's children, young people who you think need more specialist help, and give some ideas for other services, reading and resources too. So this training's been developed specifically to try and provide knowledge around children and young people's mental health problems. But we know that 1 in 4 of us will experience a mental health difficulty of some kind in our lifetime. So there's a good chance that some of the content might relate to some of our own experiences. And I guess that's particularly the case at the moment during this time of collective COVID trauma, where stress and worry is increased across the population as a whole. So as staff, we need to make sure that we're looking after our own well-being in order to be able to support and help others, including young people. So feel free to take a break, take a bit of time out, or have a chat with us afterwards if you'd like to. Do whatever you need to do. We also have some resources on staff wellbeing if you're interested, which we can send out afterwards, or you can check out on our YouTube channel, Cardiff and Vale Resilience Project. Okay, so Danielle, do you want to get us started by thinking about what do we mean by mental health?
Yeah, thank you. So what do we mean by the term mental health? It's used quite a lot in different contexts, but quite simply, mental health refers to how healthy we feel in regards to our mind, relationships, emotions and moods, and actually how this impacts our day-to-day life. Some people might actually think mental illness when they hear the term mental health, and actually they might believe that it's a black or white situation. You either have a mental illness or you don't. It's much more varied than that. We've actually thinking about sometimes we might use the phrase mental well-being to help unpick that a bit more. So our mental well-being can be defined through our cognitive well-being, our emotional well-being and our behaviours. So thinking about that a bit more, our cognitive well-being is how we see our life satisfaction and our ability to think clearly and learn about positive emotional well-being. And then when we think about our emotional well-being, is whether we're aware and able to cope with positive, but also those negative emotions. And then our behaviours, so whether we're able to function in everyday life, realise our own abilities and strengths, cope with stress, and be productive in engaging in relationships. So I think Katie's going to talk a little bit more about how mental health can be varied.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. So as Danielle was saying, mental health sometimes is thought about in terms of a diagnosis or symptoms, and it can be thought of in quite a black and white way, as though we either have mental well-being or we don't, or we have a mental health difficulty or we don't. But it's a lot more kind of varied and nuanced than that. So it's helpful to think about mental well-being or mental health symptoms as operating on a continuum. So the diagram shows those two continuums in a form of a matrix. So if we look at the diagram, what we can see, the horizontal axis represents diagnosis and symptoms. And if you fall to the left-hand side of the continuum, then you would probably be experiencing quite a lot of mental health difficulties, anxieties, or low mood. You would probably be meeting criteria for some sort of mental health difficulty. Whereas if you fall more towards the right-hand side of the continuum, then you probably would be relatively free from mental health symptoms like anxiety, low mood, things like that. And it's important to remember that, you know, we can move around on that spectrum. So, you know, if you were going through a particularly stressful time, you might move towards the left. But if things were reducing down and your stresses were changing, then you might see that you move towards the right hand side. Likewise, we've got the mental well-being continuum, and at the top if you're doing really, if things are going pretty well in your life, you're able to see family and friends, you've got a good self-care routine, you're doing the things that make you happy and make you tick, you'd be falling quite high up on that spectrum. Likewise, if you didn't maybe have many people to talk to, you were isolating and you weren't happy about that, you'd see a reduction and move down that spectrum. But now we're going to just flesh this out by looking at 2 case studies and have a think as I'm reading where you might put them on that matrix. So first of all, we've got Helen. Helen's 15 and is currently completing her GCSEs. She was previously doing well, but is now struggling to consistently attend school. This is usually due to frequent panic attacks, especially when someone mentions her upcoming exams. She's become socially withdrawn from her friends, no longer takes part in her netball team. She's currently seeing the school-based counsellor, but is yet to see a GP. So initially, we would imagine that, you know, she was doing quite well. There's no hint that she's been diagnosed with anything. We would imagine that she'd probably be falling kind of in the top right hand spectrum initially, but over the course of the months she's had an increase in mental health symptoms, the frequent panic attacks. So we'd be imagining that she's moving towards that left hand side of the horizontal continuum, and her mental well-being and fitness is reducing down. So currently we would imagine that Helen would be falling probably within that bottom right hand quadrant. Yeah, there we go. So next case study is Connor. Connor's 14 and has been diagnosed with GAD. He was also diagnosed with ADHD when he was 12 and has increasingly been struggling to manage his anxious feelings of being different to his friends and not understanding the work in lessons. Following his diagnosis, school has been allowing Connor to have extra time during class to explain the work one-to-one and has been involved in a nurture group. Recently, Connor has been seen to make great improvements in lessons and is beginning to build friendships with those in his nurture group. So initially, he had the diagnosis, he had certainly got some mental health symptoms. So he'd be falling kind of towards the left-hand side of that horizontal continuum. But and he was struggling initially and had lots of, you know, anxiety, not understanding work and lessons. So probably his mental well-being and fitness was quite low down. But since the diagnosis, he's been getting more support. School have been helping with that. And that means that his mental well-being and fitness has increased. The diagnoses are still there, but his mental well-being and fitness has increased. So he'd be probably falling in that top left-hand quadrant. So the take-home message is that things fall on a continuum, but we can move around. So just because somebody's facing difficulties at the moment, it doesn't mean that we can't do anything to support them. So I think now Gwen is going to be talking about how common it is for children and young people to have mental health difficulties.
Yeah, so I guess it's unfortunate children and young people experiencing mental health problems is increasingly common, and research has shown that 1 in 10 children will be affected by a mental health problem. And that equates to 3 in an average class size. We're also likely to see an increase in levels of distress, anxiety, low mood in our children and young people in the coming months and years to come, given the unprecedented global pandemic that we're in. What we also know from the research is that half of mental health problems begin before the age of 14. So it's really, really vital that we're able to provide those early interventions. We know that poor mental health leads to a range of poor outcomes for children and young people, including lower academic attainment. So for our pupils to be able to learn and achieve their potential, we really need to ensure that their physical and emotional needs are met so that they're in a place where they're ready to learn. What's really great though is that the research has shown that teaching staff can actually be more helpful in supporting pupils' well-being than outside agencies. After all, as educators, often have pre-existing relationships with children and young people, their families, know about their past as well as their current situations, and see them on that day-to-day basis to be able to provide that care, the boundaries and consistency that we know you all do so frequently and so naturally. So you're the experts and the pupils in your school and really can make a huge difference in terms of promoting their well-being. Okay, so we're just going to spend a little bit of time thinking about the most common mental health difficulties children and young people experience. We don't have time to go through the whole range. We're just going to focus particularly on anxiety and low mood. So anxiety is the most commonly reported mental health difficulty in children and young people. And research by Public Health England has shown that in a school of 1,000 pupils, nearly 32% self-report symptoms of anxiety. So in a school of 1,000, that would equate to an enormous 319 pupils. And I guess linking back to what Katie was describing at the beginning, anxiety, just like all other mental health difficulties, exists along a continuum. It can also centre around a range of different worries, so whether that be social situations, for example, or separating from parents or carers, specific phobias or obsessions. So there can be a whole range of things that worry can be related to. But at its core, anxiety is characterised by the emotional experience of excessive fear, and that then impacts on our behaviour. But what the research has shown that actually symptoms of anxiety are far more prevalent in girls than boys, nearly double. And there's a whole variety of different reasons as to why that might be. So biological differences, hormonal differences, differences in thinking styles, as well as a whole host of social reasons. So for example, we tend to find that boys are less likely to talk about their emotions. And we have messages in our culture such as boys don't cry and man up that can reinforce that reluctance, I guess, to talk about emotions. So what we can find is that our boys actually experiencing anxiety might present quite differently. So that may actually, an underlying anxiety may actually present as anger, or indeed withdrawal or shutting out or trying to avoid lessons as a way of escaping, for example. So thinking a bit more then about signs and symptoms of anxiety, what you can see on this slide is the cognitive and psychological symptoms of anxiety, the physical symptoms of anxiety, and some of the behavioural symptoms of anxiety too. Now, we all feel anxious from time to time, and we will all have experienced some of these psychological symptoms, the physical symptoms, and maybe sometimes the behavioural ones too. And these symptoms have evolved to keep us safe from danger. and they're entirely normal and actually really, really helpful if we are in a situation where we're in danger, because those psychological and physical symptoms motivate us to engage in behaviour to keep ourselves safe. I guess the problem comes when we repeatedly, or young people repeatedly, experience these symptoms in situations where they're not actually really in danger. So, for example, experiencing symptoms of anxiety frequently when being asked to answer a question in class, for example, or when having to engage in a peer discussion, for example. Then, if that's happening quite a lot, it can actually impact on behaviour to the extent that it's stopping us doing things that we want to be able to do, or young people want to be able to do, that will help them achieve their potential. So broadly speaking, what we tend to notice in school more frequently is those behavioural symptoms of anxiety. So the things like avoiding classes, or maybe even struggling to get to school in the first place, finding it hard to answer questions in class, or not getting the work done because children and young people might be worried about, for example, what colour to use, and get so worried about that that actually it prevents them from getting on with their work. Other things we might see is that physical restlessness or fidgeting, or some of those visible symptoms such as blushing that we might notice, or sweating that we might notice in young people as well. I guess given the current situation, we're likely to see some of these symptoms more and more in children and young people as they start to return to school. So one of the things that can really, really help, I guess, is to support young people to understand that experiencing some of these symptoms is entirely normal, particularly in the current context of the pandemic, where everyone's stress levels are increased. So one of the helpful ways that we can support children and young people is to educate them about these symptoms. So we're just going to show a nice video by Childline, which might be something that we can consider using with children and young people to help them understand anxiety.
We're all different, and there are many different feelings we can experience at different times. Some are more well known than others, such as excitement or anger, but some can be harder to understand, like anxiety. Millions of years ago, we relied on anxiety to keep us out of harm's way. At the slightest sign of danger, our bodies would bring on this uneasy, urgent feeling to jolt us into action or get us to run away. These days, our bodies still try to protect us, but life's evolved. There are loads more things to worry about, and they have a habit of piling up without us noticing. Anxiety can feel like all kinds of things. That twisted, shaky feeling in your stomach, or the strange nervousness that makes you want to hide away from the world. It can make you tired, frustrated, and upset. Anxiety can start as a simple worry, but grow into a panic, and convince you that you're losing it altogether. It can make you scared, restless, speed up your heart, but give you no explanations as to why it's happening. It might not feel like it, but anxiety is completely natural and can affect anybody for all kinds of reasons, like exam stress, family troubles, new places, or a mixture of things. It can even come for no apparent reason, but the good news is that you can reduce it, and the first step is to talk about it. Talking about how you feel is a great way to feel better. You don't have to face things alone, so if you ever want to get stuff off your chest, then you can contact Childline. They're there to listen. Different, and there are many different.
Okay, so that's just a bit of an overview of anxiety and one way where of how we can talk to children and young people about that. Katie, do you want to tell us a bit about low mood?
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. Yeah. So just to start off, we all feel low sometimes, and we've gone through lockdown. We don't have the things around us that we might usually use to keep us healthy and happy. And being a child or a young person, it's fraught with difficulties, you know, going to school. There's the anxiety and worry about going back to school or falling out with friends. If there's difficulties going on at home, it would understandably cause you to feel low. It's just when that feeling lasts for a long time or is very persistent or extreme, then we'd be thinking that this could be some sort of more of a depressive episode. It's important to remember, again, like Gwen said, that there are these gender differences. So more girls self-report low mood than boys. Just under a quarter report it compared to just under 1 in 10 boys. And there are reasons for these sex differences. You know, as Gwen mentioned before, there's that kind of narrative, boys don't cry. Boys might feel low inside, but it comes out in different ways. And so we might assume that they're very angry, but inside they might be feeling quite low. So it's really just important to find out what's going on for that individual. So if we move on to the next slide of signs and symptoms, again, we've clustered these into the cognitive, physical and behavioural clusters. So in the cognitive clusters, we've got kind of those internal thoughts of helplessness, feelings of guilt, difficulties with memory. Often when people feel very low, it's really hard to concentrate. And because your mind is focused so much on the ruminations that are going on, of that feeling of lowness, it is difficult to kind of absorb the information around us, and so often that's why we see these problems with memory. In terms of the physical signs and symptoms, there are those difficulties, changes in weight. So somebody might really lose their appetite or overeat, or sometimes we call it comfort eating, I guess. Difficulty sleeping. Often people feel very, very tired. But in the night time, when you're actually due to go to sleep, that's the time when you end up, there's nothing much going on, and that's when you might end up ruminating a lot more. So you, as teachers working with your pupils, you might notice these things a bit more than what's going on cognitively. Similarly, the behavioural symptoms, they're going to be easier to spot than the cognitive symptoms. So similar to to anxiety, low mood might cause that child or young person to avoid social situations. They might not just have any motivation to spend time with friends or family or do the things that they used to like doing. And as I said, you're going to notice physical and behavioural symptoms more, and that could be because, you know, children and young people, they might not have the emotional vocabulary to explain how they're feeling. They might not feel that safe opening up. If they don't have the kind of space, if they're not used to talking about it, it can be a very daunting process. So really it's about making them feel kind of safe enough and secure enough to say something. We have top tips sheets on low mood and anxiety, and we can circulate those with you. But now I think Danielle is going to explain a bit more about some of the key risk factors for these mental health difficulties.
Thank you. So what are ACEs? We say the phrase quite a lot. But basically, ACEs are several risk factors that are known to increase our likelihood of experiencing mental health difficulties throughout our life. So the current ACEs that are on the screen at the moment, they are from the Public Health Wales study, which took part with 2,028 adults who were aged between 18 and 69. So you can see on the screen there's 9, and the 9 that they went with were the drug use, verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, parental separation, domestic violence, alcohol abuse, incarceration, and mental illness. And the percentages underneath them are the amount of adults in Wales at the time who said they experienced those adverse childhood experiences during their childhood. So what we know about ACEs is they don't have to just be directly affecting the child. They can also affect the environment that they are living in at the time. But also, just to note, incarceration and drug use in particular would be higher in the current cohort of children at the moment. So thinking then about ACEs and actually mental health, we do know that having ACEs increases your likelihood of ever being treated or needing support for a mental illness. So when we're thinking about those children with 4 or more ACEs compared to those with children with no ACEs, they are 3.7 times more likely to have ever received treatment for a mental illness, 6.1 times more likely to have ever received treatment, and 9.5 times more likely to have ever felt suicidal or self-harmed. Obviously, this is significantly higher, and we often think about those children that we work with in schools who we know have had these ACEs, but actually knowing that they are almost 10 times more likely than another child who hasn't experienced ACEs to have felt suicidal or self-harmed is something I think that really hits home. So actually, one of the things that can help with thinking about ACEs, and we're going to go on to that and talk about it a bit more, is those protective factors. So the biggest thing that we think about is actually having an emotionally available adult. So someone who is able to support the child emotionally in times of need, listen, accept, and believe in, and ultimately just be there for that child, can really bring those statistics down and make it less likely and protect those children with ACEs. So we're going to go on to talking a bit more about some more of the risk factors now. I think Gwen's going to be talking about that.
Thanks, Danielle. So as you can see, this is a range of risk factors for children and young people to experience mental health problems. So things that increase the risk of them going on to experience mental health difficulties. And you'll notice in that family category are many of those ACEs that Danielle has just been talking about. But there are also child factors, school factors, and community factors that can increase the risk of children and young people experiencing mental health difficulties. So let's look at child factors firstly. So these are internal aspects of the child or the young person that might increase their risk. So if we just take one example, so difficult temperament, for example, research has shown that children who have been categorised as having a difficult temperament may be at increased risk of experiencing mental health difficulties. So difficult temperament is defined as a relatively consistent, constitutionally based individual difference in reactivity and self-regulation. And it's what we go on to in adulthood to refer to as personality. So in quite simplistic terms, for research purposes, babies can be categorised as easy or difficult in terms of temperament. So easy babies tend to be those who are easy to pacify, they're less reactive, they adapt quite quickly to new situations. On the other hand, babies with a difficult temperament tend to be more reactive, harder to pacify and soothe, and adapt slower to new situations. And those babies with that difficult temperament and children, because we know temperament is something that's quite stable, some research has found that they are more at risk of experiencing mental health difficulties. However, I guess what we need to bear in mind with all these risk factors is they interact in quite complex ways with each other. So if we take, for example, a child with a difficult temperament who has parents who are well supported, able to manage stress effectively, and this child's teachers in school have been able to develop some strong relationships with them. And let's say this child lives in a community that's quite affluent and safe. This child, who may have a difficult temperament, is unlikely to be affected to the same extent as a child with a difficult temperament who, let's say, the family are under a lot of stress, parents struggle to manage day to day, and teachers in school have struggled to make a connection with the child. And maybe that child is in a more deprived community as well. That child who has had those more negative experiences is likely to have a significantly increased risk, and those negative experiences might interact back again with some of those child factors. So negative experiences might result in them also experiencing more low self-esteem, and then as a result not doing as well in terms of their academic achievement either. So if we think about family factors, then obviously we've talked a bit about ACEs, but what about those more subtle family risk factors? So, for example, research has shown that parents actually having inconsistent discipline styles, so for example, that could be one parent being quite permissive and another being quite authoritarian, can actually increase the risk of mental health difficulties. And I guess that decreases predictability for the young person in the home. This risk factor, though, we can also apply to a school setting. So we know that schools where there is a really consistent approach to discipline that is shared consistently across staff and applied consistently actually have pupils with better wellbeing too. So it's worth bearing in mind that some of these risk factors can intersect the different categories. Thinking specifically, though, about risk factors in school, we know that bullying, poor quality relationships with teachers in school, and difficult peer relationships can all increase the risk of young people developing mental health problems. But reassuringly, these are all things that we can really influence in our school setting, and we're going to come on to think about how we actually promote those protective factors to decrease the risk too. In terms of community risk factors then, there is a really established evidence base that shows that growing up in an impoverished, socioeconomically disadvantaged or unsafe communities, as well as housing issues, can also increase the risk of mental health difficulties. So Katie, do you want to just unpack this a bit more by thinking about a case study?
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. Yep. So what we're going to do is look at this case study. It's Johnny. He's a 11-year-old boy who's just started secondary school. He struggles in lessons as he has dyslexia and often has aggressive outbursts when he doesn't understand the work. He had a good relationship with his class LSA. However, he's been unable to form any positive relationships with his new teachers in secondary school. Johnny has limited support at home due to mum and dad being separated, and mum is currently being treated for depression. He's currently living in an area that has high crime rates, and teachers are concerned for his welfare. So if we just start to look at some of the risk factors for Johnny. So the risk factors in terms of him, you know, him as a child, we've got the fact that he has dyslexia, he has a learning difficulty. So we know that he probably struggles to understand things quickly, and that might lead him to feel very frustrated. It highlights a difference between him and his peers, perhaps. But also it's really difficult when you do have a learning difficulty, like dyslexia, and you're in a school where the focus is on academic achievements. And that would be quite difficult for Johnny, because a lot of value is placed on doing well academically. And if he's not doing well academically, then that could affect other things like his self-esteem. So moving on to some of the family factors, we've got family breakup. Mum and dad have separated. So we don't know a lot of detail about that, but we might suspect that, you know, initially beforehand, his parents, we hope, were a secure base for him. And he could go to both of them, and they were available in theory. But having them separated, that means he's not going to be seeing either of them as much, because he might be spending some time with mum, then some time with dad. Things might feel a bit less stable at home. Maybe there's less consistency. Possibly there's differences in terms of how they're disciplining him. And it's about making sure that Johnny's got that emotionally available adult around. And if his parents are separated, then maybe there's less chance for that to be going on. There's parental mental illness as well. So his mum's being treated for depression. And unfortunately, when you have your own mental health difficulties, that's going to make you less emotionally available for other people in your life, because you have your own things going on in your mind. You're ruminating on different things. There's all of that. And whilst mum might want to be emotionally available for Johnny, the depression might be affecting that. So Johnny might not be able to get kind of as his needs supported as much as he did when mum didn't suffer from low mood. Looking at the school factors, we've got the poor pupil to teacher relationships, and the fact that he's unable to form positive relationships with his new teachers in secondary school. So, I mean, at home, we know that his parents aren't maybe around as much. And then in school, again, it's, you know, if you don't have the support going on in school, then where is Johnny getting kind of a supportive relationship from? There's a lot of change, moving to secondary school, not having those relationships. So maybe he's feeling lonely. We don't know, but that would be certainly a risk factor going on there. And then the community. So the fact that he's living in an area that has high crime rates, it could affect him in lots of different ways. Whether he's allowed to go outside and play with his friends, that might be impacted on. When he's outside, he might see things that he wouldn't want to see. He might notice that there are antisocial people around, people making comments, shouting. Lots of different things could be impacting on him in his area, and that general sense that the world outside is maybe not as safe as he would like. But it's not, you know, these things aren't fixed. We can do things to change those things. So let's go back to Gwen, who'll talk a bit more about kind of the protective factors and things that we can do to help Johnny.
Thanks, Katie. So you'll see the same categories we've got in terms of protective factors. And obviously there's things that we can do in our school setting to try and increase protective factors around a child to promote their resilience. But we can also, within our school settings, impact on protective factors in the child's domain, in the family domain, and to some extent in the community domain as well. So in terms of internal child factors, for example, let's take the first one, secure attachment experience. What the research has shown is that this doesn't necessarily have to come from a parent. So a secure attachment with an available adult, any available adult, so whether that is a learning support assistant, a teacher, a sports coach, it doesn't really matter who that adult is, as long as there is that secure attachment there. That actually, in and of itself, can reduce the risk of children going on to develop mental health problems. In terms of family factors then, if we think about parental support for education, so we know that some parents themselves may not have had the best experiences of education, and that can actually transfer onto their ability to support their child's education. So in the same way that developing really strong relationships with the child is important, developing those really strong relationships with families, as I'm sure you all do, is also really, really key. So that parent, just having one person in the school that they feel able to talk to and trust, can really support them in being able to support their child's learning. If we think about school factors that we can influence then, one of the things and one of the key principles, which I'm sure you've heard a huge amount about, is the whole school approach to promoting wellbeing. So what this means is the whole school culture promoting children and young people's wellbeing. So both the school's policies, but also all the people within it. So pupils' wellbeing really being everyone's business, right through from reception staff, dinner ladies, teachers, LSAs, senior management, everyone having a role to play in terms of supporting wellbeing, as well as those organisations who might come in externally to think about children's wellbeing, our school nurses, our counsellors, who also have that really, really important role to play. But I guess whilst we know their role can be invaluable, it is those regular, consistent and predictable supportive interactions that staff within the school do so frequently and so naturally that really can have an enormous impact on children's wellbeing in the school. And we'll come on to think in a bit more detail about some of the other school-based things that we can do to enhance protective factors as well. If we just touch on what we can do in terms of the community protective factors, whilst of course there's some things that we might have really, really limited ability to impact, like housing, school having those strong links to community organisations, who support extracurricular activities, for example, as well as other organisations. So our statutory organisations like social services, Families First, Early Help, for example, and third sector organisations. Those really strong links can actually help to pull in a network around a child, which can put the things in place that might help improve and promote wellbeing. So Katie, do we want to think a bit more about how that might apply for Johnny in terms of the protective factors?
Yeah, okay, so going back to Johnny, if we start with the fact that he has a learning difficulty and dyslexia. So one thing that we could do is look at interventions around his communication skills, so supporting him to communicate when he's struggling, and we could do that using like a traffic light system. So if he's starting to find things a bit hard and tough, he could, you know, indicate with an amber or a red traffic light to show the teacher or his teaching assistant that he needs a bit of time out or a little bit of extra support. Moving on to the family factors, we could look at having an open door policy for children to raise problems and having that emotionally available adult. So the fact that his parents are splitting up, we might as I said before, we might think, well, that, you know, having an emotionally available adult might, the time with an emotionally available adult might have reduced down somewhat. And so how can we make sure that Johnny has someone to go to in school to talk about how things are, and to maybe talk about things going on at home? And having that open door policy means that he'd know that it's okay for him to go and see someone, maybe at lunchtime or something like that. Moving on, we could think about, well, the fact that his parents are separating. We're going to really need those clear communication channels between both parents. There might be some scope for difficulties with communicating with parents if they're not talking to each other. So how do we forge relationships with both mum and dad to make sure that that they're all in the loop with Johnny? And now moving on, we could think about having protected time with that emotionally available adult. So maybe having an open door policy isn't enough, and we need to make sure that Johnny knows that, you know, he can at lunchtime, between, you know, 12 and 1, the door to a teacher that he likes is open for him, and he has that space to go and speak to him. Should be noted though that we wouldn't want Johnny to just have one kind of emotionally available adult in school. It's about developing relationships with a few people in case somebody's off sick, or, you know, things like that. Things come up. People are in meetings, so having access to a few people who he feels like he can trust and develop a relationship with is really important. And then lastly, maybe we could look at, well, you know, in the wider community, we've got those high crime rates, and so it's hard to target that necessarily. But what we can do is build up that sense of school community. We want Johnny to feel like other people, that, you know, he is in a safe environment and other people are okay and that he's included. So we could think about setting up involvement in school clubs, like sports clubs and clubs that aren't necessarily to do with academic achievement, particularly because he's got some learning needs. We want to move that emphasis over to other things like sports or just social skills, things like that. So I think now what we've got, we're going to go over to Danielle, who has some other ideas for you.
Yeah, thank you. So there are some other ideas thinking about school specifics that I think we should consider when we're working with children and young people. I think the biggest one, and sometimes it might be overlooked, is actually supporting staff well-being. So we know that, you know, if you're struggling with your own well-being, it's really difficult to provide that support to pupils. There are lots of different ways we can think about staff well-being, and it's about having that regular supervision and check-in within the school system for staff. You know, we talk about children being able to know who they can talk to when they've got problems and having that emotionally available adult, but actually it's really important that staff know the route that, you know, and they feel that they've got people within the school system to actually talk to. There are also loads of resources available to support wellbeing. The Resilience Project is actually developing some at the moment, which we can share with you with the details at the end. The next thing we've got is safety cues. So facial expressions, body language, physical environment. So actually children, particularly children with ACEs, might not necessarily view facial expressions and body language in the same way that children who haven't had those experiences. So they might view something like a straight face as actually a threat. So it's about being aware that actually the way that our face looks and our body looks actually might be sending messages to those children that we don't necessarily mean. So thinking about then celebrating different achievements. So as we mentioned already, actually achievements don't always have to be academic. it's really good to sort of push children to embrace achievements in day-to-day life. That could be thinking about rewards for kindness or consideration, all those skills really that we're trying to sort of embrace in children and young people. So looking beyond the behaviour. So actually our behaviour, sometimes when we think of a child, if a child's being very aggressive maybe, it might be that actually we've got to consider what's going on behind the surface. So actually thinking of that iceberg model. So what we can see and actually what's underneath, and unpicking that and actually involving the child in that as well. So sometimes, you know, that young person might not necessarily understand themselves why they're acting in a specific way. So actually supporting them to understand that and think beyond, well, why am I feeling like this? Or, you know, and then that's the way that we work forward. Yeah, and then we've got supporting with transition. So we know transition is a really, really stressful experience for any child or young person. And actually that transition doesn't always have to be the big moving from primary to secondary, or going on from sort of the end of GCSEs to A-levels or beyond. But actually those transitions could be something as simple as that kind of coming into school in the morning. We know that there's lots of children with anxiety that might struggle with that transition of coming from home to school and then school to home. So actually thinking about ways that actually we can support with that transition. And like we've already said, it's about having someone as familiarity, that emotionally available adult. So having some kind of consistency between those transitions is really important. Yeah, and then staff awareness of how to help children and young people develop coping skills. So we've actually got one of our top tips around emotional regulation, with a real sort of impact and thought behind actually co-regulation before self-regulation. Children learn from other people, so we can't expect them to just all of a sudden, you know, go off and actually know how to regulate themselves. They learn from us. So actually thinking about those ways that we can help co-regulate together through mindfulness or grounding activities can really help them to build those skills, so that in the future, when they are in those situations where they're feeling very stressed or under a lot of pressure, they can put those coping skills in together. And then most importantly, empathy. So I know Katie's going to talk a bit more about this now, but actually empathy is so important, because you're allowing the child to know that actually you do understand and you want to support them. So I think Katie's going to talk a bit more about that now.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. Yes, there's a preconception sometimes that talking about emotions could make it worse. But actually there's lots and lots of evidence that shows that it helps. It really does help. As Gwen said earlier, teaching staff are in a really good position to help and support children and young people. You're present, consistent, you've got knowledge about the child, you've got knowledge about the family, you've got those pre-existing relationships, and you see them every day. So actually you're in a really good position to have those conversations and to start having conversations. And the trauma-informed schools training highlights that empathy is a huge way of supporting children and young people. There's lots of evidence that shows that providing a space to listen and reflect and show this empathy increases emotional vocabulary, develops the frontal lobe, which is responsible for emotion regulation, social skills, trust of others, a whole host of things. And it's really about creating that whole school environment that allows an open discussion of emotions, which normalizes it, and shows the young person that it's okay to talk about emotions. Other people experience similar emotions to me. It might feel daunting to have these conversations and to know where to start. So we've created some conversation starters that we can share with you, with the schools as well. And so, for example, you might say to a young person, I really want to know how it's been going for you? I think what you're saying is this. That sounds really difficult. Stuff like that. Just getting them to feel like you're listening, you're tuning in, and that they're not in this alone. So the next slide has a video about empathy and the difference between empathy and sympathy. And as we're watching that, have a think about why empathy is so important.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Yeah, so that's a lovely video, isn't it? That highlights that difference between empathy and sympathy, and it just shows how easy it is to jump to finding a solution, but actually just sitting with the emotion and listening and just trying to tune in is what that young person actually needs in that moment in time. So now I think we're going to be going on to the promoting resilience during lockdown, and Danielle will be talking a bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think like the video from Brené Brown on empathy, and I think it's really important that that's how we think about things when we're interacting. How would we want someone to interact with us if we were sharing something? And I think that's what it comes down to. And actually, you know, the current situation is a really good example of that. You know, I think all throughout ACEs and stuff at the moment, we keep hearing the phrase collective trauma, because actually we are all going through something that's very different and is something that we all haven't experienced before. So actually it's okay to have negative emotions, and that's the same for you or for the pupils, and actually remembering to check in with each other and with our children and young people. So one of the ways that we could think about promoting that resilience during lockdown is actually regulating through that predictability and structure. Like we said previously, children who have experienced those adverse childhood experiences are actually find transitions and change very much more difficult than a child who hasn't had any ACEs. So thinking about having those scheduled activity lesson at predictable times each day. So it could be that actually you're trying to work with the parents to make sure that actually you're putting in some structure at home. Or actually just checking in at the same time every day. So for a young person, if you know a child who maybe particularly needs those extra check-ins right now, that actually if you say to them, okay, every Wednesday at 10 o'clock, I'm going to call you and check in, or however it works within your school, actually you stick to that, and then they know that that's going to happen. And then trying to think about what can remain the same. So especially if you work closely with a particular child, you might have a certain routine or something that you do, thinking about how can you adapt that online. So for instance, if on a Monday morning you have a check-in and maybe you talk about what you did on the weekend, that's something that you could still bring in and is actually keeping that routine and that structure. Revisiting material you've covered before, so anything familiar is really helpful to sort of ground the child and bring them back to being able to cope with the current situation. Reminiscing about positive things or events that have happened in school in the past. There's a lot of negative information going around right now. You turn on the news, and these children and young people are experiencing that, and they're experiencing that by directly seeing it or seeing the stresses in parents or teachers. So it's really important to think about the positives, and that doesn't mean that we ignore the negatives. We still need to embrace those and talk about them and discuss them, but also thinking about positive things and things relating back to school is really useful. And then, like I said before, transition is really important. So I know that schools are obviously starting to think about reopening now at the end of June. So actually that transition of going back, how can we try and keep things the same? How can we regulate these children through predictability and structure? Is it that they go back to the same class? So, you know, thinking about maybe making sure that all their form is the same. Obviously, we can have a bit more of a discussion around individual schools or ideas, and also provide some resources on that going forward. And actually, as the video says, and what's been saying all along, is connection is key. So being able to have that connection with the pupil is actually one of the biggest resilience factors in itself. Is being able to show someone, actually, I'm here for you, and actually I care, and let's try and think about how we can make things. So thinking about our check-ins, obviously at the moment, is utilising what is available. Obviously, face-to-face is much better, but given the current situation, we can't do that. So actually, is it over the phone? Is it through a video call? Is it actually just sending an email? So a lot of the children have hub accounts. Is it something that actually maybe as a teacher, you could be sending out a picture to remind themselves, thinking back again to that previous slide, thinking of those positive experiences in schools and trying to relate that back into virtually. And as we've spoken before about actually thinking about our facial expressions, our gestures, our body language, and actually how we're talking, those children with ACEs might see that blank face and as a threat. So actually we really need to make sure that when we are interacting over virtual things, that we are emphasizing those smiling faces, those storytelling voices, where we're up and down, and thinking about maybe some relational activities during those virtual sessions. So if you're thinking about how you might build up that relationship in school, it might be through games, through shared interests. These are things that you can still do, but via virtual. You could do something like a fun quiz, an activity, or even try and think about ways you could play a game. And also thinking about those transitional objects. So Louise Bauman talks about a lot about transitional objects within school, where the staff member or parent will give an object to the child, and that child then has that object, and it helps them to remind them that that person is thinking about them, and actually they're going to see them again. So actually doing a transitional object online might be a really good thing. We could send a picture, send a message, and actually that child then's got something that they can look at and help them think about school. And then when we think about the tasks that we're setting at the moment, give them purpose and meaning. So something that's linked to that learning content, something that's linked to the experiences that we want them to get at the moment. So that might be reading around topics or sharing new skills or things that have been tried, and actually just trying to help the child think about, what are we doing right now? Why is it important? And how is this going to help me? So yeah, I think Gwen's going to talk a bit about now where the children need to access those further services.
Yeah, so thanks, Danielle. I think there's a huge range of things we can do as professionals working in education settings in order to help promote resilience. But I guess sometimes we will have those children and young people who actually do need some specialist support. And the system for accessing the statutory NHS child and adolescent mental health support services, there's a whole range of them, is to ask parents to take their children and young people to the GP in order to ask for a referral. Once those referrals go in from GPs, they go to something called a single point of access meeting, where professionals from each of the services, so primary mental health, child and adolescent mental health services, emotional wellbeing service, and neurodevelopmental teams, think about which team is best situated in order to meet that child's needs, with the expectation being, I guess, that universal interventions at that tier within schools and in the community will have been tried prior to specialist support going in. The idea that prevention is always better. We as the Resilience Project sit alongside these services, and as staff members spend some time working into these services too. And our remit is very much to provide direct support to education in terms of advice, guidance and consultation, alongside the inclusion and engagement services too. So please do get in touch with us and the inclusion engagement services if you'd like support around specific young people or around training or resources. And next slide, please, Danielle. Thank you. So some of our resources that we've developed and mentioned throughout this training are going to be on the hub in coming weeks. If you don't have access to that, please do email us and we can send resources out to you. As I've mentioned, we're also on YouTube, Cardiff and Vale Resilience Project, if you'd like to look at some of our animations there. And we've just put up a brief list there of some other helpful websites and books that you might be interested in if you want to find out more. Okay. So we've got a bit of time now to have a think about questions. So we've got about 10 minutes. Danielle, what are the questions and thoughts and reflections that people have been raising?
Yeah, so there's a few questions on there at the moment. Please feel free to add any questions now that you've got as you're going along. So the first one is, how would you help children come forward who are reluctant to seem different by saying they are struggling, the ones who may not want to be singled out?
Okay, so I think, yeah, really good question, because we do have many children and young people who don't want to be singled out. Or I guess it's a very vulnerable thing as well, just to say that you're struggling too. Some of the things we can do around that, I think, are really thinking about whole class activities that we can do. So things like integrating into our school structures, things like daily check-ins that we do with the whole class. So we might be particularly paying attention to some young people who we know are vulnerable in those answers, but we're doing it as a whole class activity, so no young person is singled out. So these could be things like using regulating activities that involve movement, so generally rhythmic things like doing star jumps or passing a ball around, rhythmic clapping games, which I know lots of schools do already. Those are really, really great ways, I guess, of trying to get some regulation in at the beginning as well as, I guess, those more down regulating activities we can do as a whole class. So things like breathing exercises, for example, can be really, really helpful too. The other thing, I guess, that I was thinking about is these are the children and young people who probably are going to have the greatest impact in terms of their well-being from those people who are seeing them day to day, day in, day out. So your class LSAs, teachers, and so forth, because they're likely to be the children who won't want to engage and be singled out to engage in those more targeted services that we might have. So I guess it's about thinking, where can we grab those opportunities to have quite natural chats with them, I guess, about how they're doing, and use ways of indirectly finding out what's going on for them. So, for example, if we're doing a check-in using metaphors like the weather or superheroes, as ways of describing how we're feeling, which makes it one step removed from saying directly maybe how we actually are, and taking those opportunities, whether individually or in small group activities, or as broader parts of lessons. So if particular themes come up in books, for example, that you could be looking at in an English class, taking those as part of the broader school day, rather than at specified times where that child might have to be pulled out. Katie, have you got other thoughts on that question?
What you've suggested is really, really great. I know in some other schools they've got circle times going with the groups of kids that are, for whatever reason, struggling a bit, and they can have like sitting on bean bags, having a hot chocolate, and just, you don't have to be talking about things that are going on, but it's knowing that other people are there that are going through similar situations potentially, or doing those other activities like you've suggested, so that conversations can kind of happen organically, and it's more about building up the relationships with the staff so that eventually the young person might feel able to open up a bit more. Yeah, those were kind of my additional thoughts on it, but it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Yeah.
Thanks, Katie. Danielle, have we got other questions?
Yeah. So the next one is, one of the child factors mentioned was deviant peer influences. How would you suggest dealing with these?
Okay, crikey, it's such a difficult area, and I think schools do an incredibly good job of managing all those complicated peer interactions that we get, particularly as children go into adolescence. The thing that's coming into my mind, I guess, is thinking about looking under that behaviour for those children who are engaging in relationships that maybe aren't so helpful. What are the underlying needs that they are meeting through those unhelpful relationships, and why are they getting it there and not elsewhere, I guess, and thinking about, are there things that we can put in so maybe they can meet that need in another more healthy and helpful way. The other things I guess I was thinking about was more broadly things in school, so things like having a relationship policy about how do we expect adults to interact with children in the school, children to interact with children, and so forth. And I guess bolstering that through consistent application, and then maybe some targeted interventions around interpersonal relationships for children who struggle with those to a greater extent. But I do think it's a really, really tough area. Katie, what are your thoughts?
Well, one thing that we know in terms of the research is that you're less likely to engage in kind of antisocial behaviours if you recognise emotions like particularly sadness, distress, fear in other people, because you have the empathy to understand what your behaviours impact, how it's impacting on the people around you. So actually these empathy conversations will really help with that just generally, as will the things like focusing on the non-academic achievement. It's like you said, it's unpicking what's going on underneath. So if we think that people are hanging around with deviant peers because they're not engaged in work, they're disconnecting from the classroom and they want to spend time with other people, then how can we promote the non-academic achievements, and how can we improve those positive peer interactions and get them involved in other things going on in the school? So but yeah, I think that the development of those empathy kind of conversations will really help with that antisocial behaviour, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Danielle, have we got any more questions?
Yeah, we've got one more. So given the issues staff are dealing with are often very emotional and can impact well-being, what is the most effective way for staff to manage their emotional well-being?
I think for me, the first thing that I would really focus on is getting the kind of the basics in place, you know, in terms of your physical needs are actually being met, that you're getting the basics like sleep, having, you know, proper break so that you can have your food, so that you can recharge, so that, you know, that you're getting your annual leave. It's hard to always do that. I know that teachers, it's thought that they have lots of holidays, but actually you're doing so much in your spare time, preparing lessons, all of that side of things. So it's making sure that you're making time for you, and that your physical and your mental health needs are being met, and that you've got a kind of a good self-care routine going on in your day-to-day life. Seeing family, seeing friends. For me, it would be starting off with those basics. What about you, Gwen? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's really important, I guess, to get those basics right, like you were saying. And I was just thinking about, obviously, as staff going back into educational settings during this time now, how getting those basics right is going to be really, really important. But also thinking about, for our staff, making sure we are well regulated first. So in order to be able to help others, we need to be, you know, feeling okay ourselves. So actually, firstly, thinking about how do we increase staff's felt safety about going back? Do we need a bit of time as staff to get used to going back into the school environment? Things are going to be different, I guess. Some things will be the same, but thinking about how has the environment changed? How do we feel when we're walking around the school now with these different things in place before the kids get there? So we can think about how we're going to respond before we have to help regulate the children. And then secondly, thinking about connection. So making sure as staff, we get time to reconnect with each other first. Connection's really, really important in times of stress, not just for the kids, but for us too, so doing that first. Thirdly, I think thinking about sadness and loss. For some of us, we might have had small losses during this lockdown time, so not being able to go to classes, maybe we want to, not being able to go to the gym, not being able to go to the pub, all those things, so, you know, small losses. For other people, we may have had really big losses, so losing a family member, maybe not being able to meet a new grandchild. Some of those really big life events might have happened during this time. So I guess honouring and making space for that in our staff group, I think, is really important. Before we go on to the final thing of thinking about what have we actually appreciated during this time and enjoyed, and what can we appreciate going forwards.
Yep, so we've got another question about transitions. So it says, you mentioned about children and young people going back to school, but this will be a non-routine approach. How do you think pupils will cope with this particular uncertainty, especially pupils in year 6 who should be transitioning to high school?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly difficult time, really unprecedented. And I guess we know that the children who have the least vulnerability the vulnerability factors in the first place are likely to cope a little bit better. But those who already have existing vulnerabilities, if we think about the stress vulnerability model, they already have some vulnerabilities, and then we've got layered on top of that the stress of the pandemic, not having proper endings in school, for example. Maybe it's been a very stressful time at home during lockdown. It's likely that those children are going to struggle so much more with that transition. So I think it's really, really important to think about any things we can do in this last period where children are going back in this non-routine way to actually mark that ending in year 6 for those primary kids. So how do we celebrate their time in primary school? Can we make some transitional objects that can remind them of those people in that primary school, their friends, their teachers, that they can take with them to look back on them? Can we spend time reminiscing about those good times that we've had in primary school, as well as then starting to think about what is secondary school going to be like? So I know some schools have done some really lovely videos of the school and how things are going to be when they come back, which I think are really helpful. I know some schools have also set up some parents Q&A sessions to think about transitions too. So I think things like that are really, really important. Communicating from school to home, what's going to be the same? Because I guess those are the things that we know are containing and helpful, those things that are predictable. What's going to be the same? Let's think about those, and then let's think about how things are going to be different. Katie, have you got any thoughts on that?
That sounds lovely. I was just thinking as you were talking about the things you can do in school, like creating a nice memory box of your time in primary school and with your classmates, or like a coping skills box as well, thinking about what are the practical things you can do to cope with change, and you know, like Gwen said, the similarities with high school and the current school that they're in. What are there any breathing exercises, any emotional tools that they've got, sensory coping skills, so like finding soft objects, things that are going to bring them some sense of kind of calmness when they're feeling dysregulated and anxious. So things like that I think could be helpful, and get them to think about, well, how did they cope with the change going working from home, and what things made them happy in that situation, and get them to think about kind of what can they keep in place when they move up to high school as well.
I've just remembered as well, there's been a really nice resource done by the Anna Freud Centre about managing transitions back to school as well. So we can send out the link for that, and also one by the College of Occupational Therapists too, so we can forward those on.
Yeah, and then there's another question. It says, what strategies would be most beneficial for pupils who display their anxiety as complete dysregulation. As you've mentioned, boys tend to display their anxiety through aggression.
Yeah, okay. So I guess for me, what I would be thinking about really, really broadly, I guess, in terms of distress, is Bruce Perry's neurosequential model. So what he talks about is the first thing we need to focus on is regulation. So what are the things we can do to help that child regulate? And like Danielle was saying earlier, specifically thinking about, we are probably, if they're really dysregulated, going to need to do that co-regulation first. So as an adult, we're going to have to take the lead in helping them to calm down. That might just be being alongside them and being with them, not actually saying very much or doing very much. It might just be the being with. But it might also be, for example, so dispersal activities. So particularly with boys, sometimes actually getting some of that energy out first through, you know, doing intense exercise, for example, needs to happen before they can settle and do the more down-regulating activities like breathing activities, for example, or using a soothe box or a calm box, something like that. So doing regulation first, then focusing on relating, so establishing that connection through empathy. And then finally, once we've done all those bits, coming to the reasoning, so trying to understand what's gone on and think about it. And I guess that neurosequential model replicates the way that children's brains develop. So it's a bottom-up approach to calming our lower brain stem, and then our limbic system in the middle of our brain, before focusing on our frontal lobes up here and doing that reasoning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. That doing that sounds like that's the best approach. And there's also resources in terms of distress tolerance skills that there are lots of that sort of stuff out there. But going with you're getting the aggression out there through physical activity, and then going to the soothing activities is probably going to be the most effective. Because you're not gonna, when someone's up there, you can't go into let's talk about how you're feeling or anything like that. That's not going to work. You need to wait until there's been some sort of decompression.
I guess the other thing, of course, to hold in mind is that, we're all different and every young person's different. So what might work for one might not work for another, but broadly the principles of taking that bottom-up approach in terms of regulating, relating, and then reasoning, regardless of whether it's different things you do in between, can be helpful. Okie doke. I'm aware of the time. Have we covered everyone's questions, Danielle?
Yeah, that's everyone's.
Lovely. Okay, fab. Thank you so much for your time this morning and for listening and for your really, really interesting questions. If you've got any questions for us, please do get in touch if anything comes up afterwards that you haven't thought of. And also, we would really, really value your feedback. So Danielle will pop a link to an evaluation form. If you could spend just a couple of minutes giving us your feedback, we'd really, really appreciate that in terms of thinking of how we can improve in future. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.